I grew up in a small rural town in Michigan, where most of the houses were separated by acres of dense forest. Our backyard was massive, stretching out into the woods like an endless green carpet, and at its edge stood my childhood treasure, the treehouse. My dad built it when I was 7, a sturdy wooden structure nestled between 2 thick oak trees. It wasn't anything fancy, just a simple platform with walls, a roof, and a small window that overlooked the forest. But to me, it was magical. I'd spend hours up there reading, drawing, or just staring out at the woods, listening to the rustling leaves and birdsong. It was my safe haven. That all changed the summer I turned 12. It was late July, and the days were hot and sticky. My best friend Sam had come over for the weekend, and we decided to camp out in the treehouse. My parents had no problem with it. They trusted the treehouse, and our small town wasn't the kind of place where you worried about safety. We dragged sleeping bags, snacks, and flashlights up the creaky wooden ladder and settled in for the night. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the woods grew darker and quieter, the usual sounds of chirping crickets and distant owls filling the air. Around midnight we were playing cards by flashlight when we heard it, a faint whistling sound coming from the woods. At first, we thought it was the wind, but the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic. It rose and fell, almost like a tune, and it seemed to be getting closer. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. Sam nodded, his face pale in the dim light. "It's probably just some animal." We tried to ignore it, but the whistling continued, growing louder with each passing minute. It circled the treehouse, moving from one side to the other, and I felt a chill run down my spine. "Let's just go inside," Sam said, his voice shaking. I nodded, but as we moved toward the ladder, the whistling stopped. The sudden silence was almost worse than the sound itself. "Maybe it's gone," I said, more to convince myself than him. We waited, holding our breath, but the forest remained quiet. Finally, we climbed down the ladder and made a run for the house, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The next morning, I told my parents about the whistling. My dad laughed it off, saying it was probably a bird or the wind playing tricks on us. I wanted to believe him, but something about the sound had felt wrong, unnatural. A week later, I decided to spend the night in the treehouse alone. I told myself I was being silly, that there was nothing to be afraid of, and I wanted to prove I wasn't scared. I brought my sketchbook and a lantern, hoping to distract myself. The night was calm, the woods bathed in silver moonlight. For hours, I sat by the window, drawing the twisted shapes of the trees and listening to the usual nighttime sounds. Then, around midnight, the whistling started again. This time, it was louder, more deliberate. The tune was slow and haunting, the kind of sound that crawls under your skin and stays there. I froze, gripping my lantern tightly as the sound moved closer, circling the treehouse just like before. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. The whistling stopped. I leaned out the window, shining my lantern into the woods. The light barely penetrated the darkness, but for a brief moment, I thought I saw movement, something pale darting between the trees. I climbed down the ladder as fast as I could and ran back to the house. My parents were asleep, and I didn't want to wake them, so I locked the door and sat in the living room, staring out the window until the sun came up. The next morning, I told my dad what had happened. He looked concerned but tried to reassure me, saying it was probably just a prank or an animal. Still, he agreed to check the treehouse with me. When we climbed up, everything seemed normal, until we saw the carvings. On the inside walls of the treehouse were dozens of strange symbols, scratched into the wood with something sharp. They were crude and uneven, but they looked deliberate, like someone had spent a long time making them. My dad's face darkened as he ran his fingers over the marks. "Did you do this?" he asked. I shook my head. "I swear I didn't." He didn't say anything else, but I could tell he was unsettled. That night, my dad stayed up late, sitting by the window with a flashlight and a rifle. He didn't say what he was looking for, but I knew he was worried. I stayed in my room, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Around 2 a.m., I heard the whistling again. This time, it was closer, right outside my window. I pulled the covers over my head, my heart pounding. The whistling grew louder, more insistent, and I thought I heard faint footsteps on the gravel outside. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, my dad found footprints in the dirt by my window. They were large, barefoot, and strange, almost human, but with elongated toes that ended in claw-like impressions. He called the police, but they didn't find anything. For the next few weeks, the whistling continued. Sometimes it came from the woods, sometimes from the yard, and once, horrifyingly, from the roof of the house. Finally, my dad decided enough was enough. He tore down the treehouse, burning the wood in a pile at the edge of the property. After that, the whistling stopped. We never figured out who, or what, had been in the woods, but the memory still haunts me. Even now, as an adult, I can't hear whistling without feeling a chill run down my spine. When I was 13, my family moved to a rural town in Oregon. It was one of those places where everyone knew each other, and the biggest event of the year was the county fair. My parents had bought a house on the edge of a large forest, a fixer-upper with a backyard that stretched into the trees. One of the things I loved most about the property was the treehouse. It was old and weathered, but surprisingly sturdy, perched in the thick branches of a massive pine tree about 50 yards from the house. My dad said the previous owners had built it for their kids, but it had been abandoned for years. For me, it was a dream come true. I spent every chance I could up there, reading, drawing, or just staring out at the forest. It felt like my own private world, until the night I saw the lantern. It started on a late summer evening. My parents were out at a neighborhood barbecue, and I was left home alone. I decided to spend the evening in the treehouse, bringing along a flashlight, a blanket, and my sketchbook. The sun was just setting as I climbed the ladder, the warm light filtering through the branches. As darkness fell, the forest came alive with its usual sounds, the rustle of leaves in the wind, the distant hoot of an owl, and the occasional chirping of crickets. It was peaceful, and I quickly lost myself in my sketches. But around 9 p.m., I noticed something strange. A faint light flickering in the woods. At first I thought it was a firefly, but the glow was too steady, too deliberate. It moved slowly, bobbing between the trees like someone carrying a lantern. I froze, my heart pounding. Our house was pretty isolated, and the forest behind it stretched for miles. There shouldn't have been anyone out there. I turned off my flashlight, crouching low by the window as I watched the light. It moved closer, weaving between the trees, until it stopped directly below the treehouse. "Hello?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. No answer. The light remained still, flickering faintly like a candle. I stayed frozen in place, my eyes locked on the light. After what felt like an eternity, it began to move again, this time circling the base of the tree. My stomach churned with fear as I realized whoever, or whatever, was holding the lantern was trying to climb the tree. Grabbing my flashlight, I shone it down into the darkness. The beam cut through the shadows, revealing nothing but the swaying branches. The light from the lantern was gone. I waited for a few more minutes, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts, but the forest was silent. Finally, I climbed down the ladder and ran back to the house, locking the doors behind me. The next morning, I told my parents what had happened. My dad checked the woods but didn't find anything, no footprints, no lantern, nothing out of the ordinary. He said it was probably just a camper or a hunter passing through, but his tone didn't sound convincing. I avoided the treehouse for the next few days, but my curiosity eventually got the better of me. One afternoon, I climbed up to see if there were any signs of what had happened that night. At first, everything seemed normal, until I found the symbol. It was carved into the floorboards of the treehouse, a strange, looping design that looked like an eye with 3 concentric circles around it. The edges were rough, as though it had been scratched into the wood with something sharp. My stomach turned as I traced my fingers over the grooves. This hadn't been there before. That night, the lantern returned. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I noticed the faint glow through my curtains. My heart sank as I realized it was coming from the direction of the treehouse. I got up and peeked out the window, my stomach twisting in fear. The light was back, bobbing gently among the trees. This time, it was closer to the house. I grabbed my dad's old binoculars from the shelf and focused on the light. Through the lenses, I saw a figure holding the lantern, a tall, shadowy shape with unnaturally long limbs and a head that seemed too large for its body. Its movements were jerky, almost insect-like, as it paced back and forth beneath the treehouse. The figure stopped suddenly, its head snapping upward as if it had sensed me watching. I dropped the binoculars, my hands shaking, and pulled the curtains shut. For the rest of the night, I sat by the window with the lights off, my heart pounding every time I thought I heard a noise outside. The next morning, my dad found the same symbol from the treehouse carved into the bark of the pine tree. This time, he didn't dismiss it. He called the local sheriff, who came out to take a look. The sheriff, a grizzled man in his late 50s, inspected the carving with a furrowed brow. "Looks like some kind of prank," he said, though his tone was uncertain. "Probably just some teenagers messing around." For a while, things went back to normal. The lantern didn't appear again, and I started to feel safe enough to visit the treehouse during the day. But the peace didn't last. One evening, as I was sitting in the treehouse sketching, I heard a sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from the woods. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, echoing through the trees like someone knocking on wood. I looked out the window and saw the lantern again, flickering between the branches. This time, there were 2 lights. I froze, my mind racing. The tapping grew louder, faster, as the lights moved closer to the treehouse. Grabbing my flashlight, I shone it toward the lights, hoping to scare off whoever was out there. The beam revealed 2 figures standing at the base of the tree. They were identical to the one I'd seen before, tall, spindly, and wrong. Their heads tilted in unison as the tapping stopped. Then they began to climb. Panic surged through me as I scrambled down the ladder, jumping the last few rungs and sprinting toward the house. The figures didn't follow, but the lanterns flickered brighter as I ran, casting long, jagged shadows across the yard. When I reached the house, I slammed the door shut and locked it, my chest heaving with terror. My parents rushed in, alarmed by my panic, but when they looked outside, the lights were gone. The next morning, my dad found something new in the treehouse. Sitting in the center of the floor was an old, rusted lantern, its glass cracked and blackened. Inside the lantern was a piece of paper, folded neatly. On it was a single word, scrawled in shaky handwriting. "Welcome." That was the last time I ever went near the treehouse. My dad tore it down the following week, burning the wood in a bonfire that sent thick, black smoke curling into the sky. I never saw the lanterns again, but sometimes, late at night, I hear the faint tapping sound in the distance. And I know, deep down, that they're still out there, waiting. When I was 11, my grandparents gifted me a treehouse for my birthday. It wasn't a simple wooden platform, but a full-on mini-house with walls, a roof, and even a little door and window. My dad and uncle spent weeks building it, using old wood from the barn and leftover paint from a home renovation. When it was finished, it stood proudly in the backyard, nestled in the branches of a massive oak tree. For years, the treehouse was my sanctuary. I spent hours up there reading, playing games, and hanging out with my best friend, Ben. It was the kind of place where you felt untouchable, like nothing bad could happen. But one summer, everything changed. It was the summer before I started high school, and the treehouse had become less of a hangout spot and more of a forgotten relic. Ben and I still used it occasionally, but we were spending more time playing video games or riding bikes around town. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ben and I decided to spend the night in the treehouse. It was a spur-of-the-moment idea, born out of boredom and nostalgia. We grabbed sleeping bags, flashlights, and a pack of Oreos, and climbed the ladder into the treehouse. The air was warm, and the woods behind my house buzzed with the sounds of cicadas and crickets. For a while, it felt like old times. We joked around, told ghost stories, and played cards by flashlight. But as the night wore on, an uneasy feeling began to creep over me. It started with the sound. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper coming from the woods. "Did you hear that?" I asked, pausing mid-hand of Go Fish. Ben looked up, his brow furrowed. "Hear what?" I strained my ears, but the sound was gone. "Nothing," I said, shaking it off. But a few minutes later, it came again, a soft, breathy voice, just barely audible over the hum of the night. This time, Ben heard it too. "What the hell was that?" he whispered, his eyes wide. "I don't know," I said, my stomach twisting. "Maybe the wind?" But deep down, I knew it wasn't the wind. We tried to ignore it, but the whispers continued, growing louder and more distinct. It sounded like a single word, repeated over and over. "Come! Someone's messing with us," Ben said, grabbing his flashlight. "Probably one of the guys from school." He shone the beam out the window, sweeping it across the yard and into the woods. The light caught on the twisted shapes of tree branches, but there was no sign of anyone. "See?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "No one's there." But Ben wasn't convinced. He climbed down the ladder, determined to catch whoever was messing with us. I stayed in the treehouse, clutching my flashlight like a lifeline. "Ben?" I called after a few minutes. "Did you find anything?" No response. I leaned out the window, shining my flashlight toward the woods. "Ben, this isn't funny." The whispering grew louder, more insistent, and I felt a chill crawl up my spine. It wasn't coming from the woods anymore. It was coming from beneath the treehouse. My breath caught in my throat as I leaned over the edge of the platform. The beam of my flashlight swept across the ground, illuminating the base of the tree. For a moment, I thought I saw a shadow move, a tall, slender figure that melted into the darkness. I scrambled back into the treehouse, my heart pounding. "Ben, get back here!" I shouted, but the only answer was the whispering, now echoing around me like a chorus of voices. I locked the tiny wooden door and sat in the corner, gripping my flashlight tightly. The voices seemed to swirl around the treehouse, growing louder and more distorted. Then, from the window, I heard a familiar voice. "Hey, it's me," Ben called, his tone casual. "Let me in." Relief flooded through me, and I rushed to the window. "Where were you?" "I've been." I stopped mid-sentence. Ben was standing on the ground below, looking up at me. But something was wrong. His face was pale, his expression blank, and his eyes didn't look human. They were too wide, too dark, like black holes staring into mine. "Let me in," he repeated, his voice flat and lifeless. I stepped back, my chest tightening. "You're not Ben." His mouth twisted into a smile, too wide and too sharp. "Come down," he said, his voice shifting, becoming deeper and more guttural. "We just want to play." The treehouse shook violently, the walls creaking as if something was climbing up the tree. I backed into the corner, shining my flashlight at the door, which rattled on its hinges. Suddenly, the door burst open, and I screamed, swinging the flashlight wildly. The beam caught on a figure crouching in the doorway, a pale, elongated shape with limbs that bent at impossible angles. Its face was featureless except for a gaping mouth filled with jagged teeth. I don't remember how I got down from the treehouse. One moment I was in the corner, screaming, and the next I was running across the yard, my legs burning with adrenaline. When I reached the house, I locked the door behind me and collapsed on the floor, gasping for breath. My parents found me there the next morning, still clutching the flashlight. I tried to explain what had happened, but they didn't believe me. My dad went out to check the treehouse but found nothing unusual, just an overturned sleeping bag and a few scattered cards. Ben didn't come back. His parents reported him missing the next day, and search parties combed the woods for weeks but found no trace of him. The police eventually ruled it a runaway, but I knew better. The treehouse sat abandoned for years after that. I couldn't bring myself to go near it, and my parents never forced me to. When I turned 18 and moved out, my dad finally tore it down, saying it was becoming a safety hazard. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers. Faint, distant, calling from the edge of my dreams.